So we also have these if-else-if statements. So what these if-else-if statements do is they test a series of conditions. So if-else-if is often simpler to use than a nested if. So I'm going to write down the structure of what an if-else-if looks like, and then we'll talk about why we would want to use an if-else-if instead of just a nested if. So let's say we have an if statement. So we have some expression that we're testing. So I'm just going to put expression 1, and this is the block of code that's executed if this expression is true. And then we can have an else if. And this would have an expression that we're testing. So this would be expression 2. We have what goes inside of that. We can have another else if. So this would be expression 3 and whatever's in that. And we can have as many of these as we want. And then what we're going to do is end this with a trailing else. And this is called a trailing else. And this is actually optional. You don't have to have that trailing else. But it's a good idea to have it to catch errors, because if you're going through this decision tree, and so if you're going through this and all of these expressions are false, you want to have this trailing else will basically catch that. So it's kind of a fail-safe in your program. Like, say you're expecting input from the user and the user doesn't enter what you're expecting, this trailing else will catch that and warn the user that they didn't enter a valid input. So with this if-else-if statement, we can write. So we could write this if-else-if statement with the nested if statements, but the reason why we might want to use the if-else-if sometimes instead of just a nested if is that the logic can be easier to follow in the else if. The code is often shorter, and we're going to see an example of that in a minute. And it's often better to use the if-else if rather than a nested if. So the way this works is the statement executes from the top. So it'll start here, and it's going to continue through these expressions until it finds one that's true. So in other words, if the program's executing and this first expression is true, it's going to execute what you have in this expression, and then this entire block of code will be done. So it's just going to jump to the end after it executes that statement. If this if statement here is false, but then the second else if is true, like say this expression 2 is true, then it's going to execute what you have in this statement and then jump to the end of the code. So it's going to step through these if-else-if statements until it finds one that's true. And if it doesn't find one that's true, it's just going to execute what you have here in the else statement. So let's look at an example of this program. So this is a program uses nested if-else statements to assign a letter grade, either A, B, C, D, or F, to a numeric score. So what we're doing is we have this constant integer, so A score is equal to 90, B score is equal to 80, C score is equal to 70, and D score is equal to 60. And then we have this test score. And so what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user for their test score, and then we're going to compare it to our grade thresholds and figure out if they got an A, B, C, D, or fail. So we have these, so we're using nested ifs. So we have, okay, so C out, enter your numeric test score, and I will tell you the letter grade you earned. We're going to read in and score. We're going to read in what they enter and store it to test score. And then we're going to go to this if statement. So if test score is greater than or equal to A score, so A score is 90. So this is going to see if the score they entered was greater than or equal to 90, it's going to output your grade as an A. else, if the test score is greater than or equal to B, it's going to see out your grade is a B. So this one tests to see if this test score is greater than or equal to 80. And you might be like, well, wait a second, if they have 95, isn't that greater than 80? Well, if it executes this if statement here, it's going to skip this else statement, so the rest of this code will never be executed if they got above 90. So same thing here. If the score is greater than or equal to 80, it's going to output your grade is B, and that's not going to execute the rest of these if statements. Else, if their score was less than 80, it's going to go to this if statement, where it's going to see if your test score is greater than or equal to the C score, which is 70, and if it is, it's going to output your grade as a C. And then we have this else if test score is greater than or equal to D score, which is 60, is going to output your grade as a D. Else, and so here's our trailing else in case they enter something other than what we're looking for, or if they enter something less than a D, it's going to output your grade as F. So this is done with a nested if, but we can also do this with else if statements. I want to show you how to do that and why it's going to look a lot easier. Well, it's going to be easier to read because this nested if is actually pretty hard to read. Like I have to spend some time looking at this to figure out what it's doing. But if we have the if test score is greater than or equal to A, see out your grade as A. Else if test score is greater than or equal to B, see out your grade as a B. And I'm going to move this else over so these are aligned. So now we have the else if test score is greater than or equal to C, see out your grade is a C. And it also just gets everything aligned. Like this is just way easier to read. I'm going to actually align this with the rest of this code. So see out else if. And readability, like what I'm doing now to try and make this readable, readability is just as important as your code working. If your code works but it's not readable, it's not going to be, people are going to be mad about it. Okay, so else if test score is greater than or equal to C, your grade is a C. Else, and this is another if, so else if test score is greater than or equal to D, and I'm going to move these over. So see out your grade is a D, and then I'm going to have my trailing else. And also the other thing is, since I only have one line of code on these, I don't actually need these curly brackets. I'm going to leave them in, but we don't actually need them in this case because we only have one line of code for each statement. So else, and then we have our trailing else to catch if they entered something less than 60, or if they entered a negative number, this would also catch that. And then we can delete, we can delete the rest of these curly braces because we don't need them. So see how much easier this is to read compared to the nested if. So let's go ahead and compile this and run it. PR4-12 P-O. Okay, so enter your numeric score, and I will tell you the letter grade you earned. So let's say 45. Your grade is F. Let's run it again. Say 98. Your grade is A. Run it again. Let's do 76. Your grade is C. We can see this is working. When you write code like this, you'll want to test it with a bunch of different scores just to make sure everything's working correctly. But yeah, so basically the benefit of if you can do a if elseif instead of a nested if, it's better to do the if elseif because the logic is easier to follow, it's easier to read, and the code is often much simpler.